Following the bloody and savage battle through Leicester's streets and the subsequent sacking of the town on the 31st of May and 1st of June 1645, the English Civil War seemed to balance on a knife edge. Whilst the King and his Royalist supporters celebrated their victory, news of the defeat and subsequent carnage across the town was to send shockwaves through the parliamentarian camps. Over the course of the next 17 days, as the repercussions of the Siege of Leicester were to play out, the First Civil War was to come to a dramatic and bloody conclusion, with the people of Leicester and Leicestershire never far from the heart of the action. I'm Jim Butler. Welcome to Hidden Histories of Leicester and UnCivil War, Part 3. Following the horror and bloodshed of the 1st of June, there becomes an urgent need to clear the dead from Leicester's streets. First of all of the carcasses of the hundreds of dead horses are gathered up and piled at the town's 4 gates, whilst other folks use buckets of water and try to wash away the blood from the streets. Next, the bodies of the 709 men and women killed during the battle and looting are collected from around the town and are buried. In 1951, in the corner of this herb garden behind me in the former Trinity Hospital in the Newark, a mass grave was discovered that is believed to date from the 17th or 18th century. Rows of east-west facing burials were discovered, all without coffins, with some overlying each other in a haphazard manner. This corresponds with the town's Chamberlain accounts for the year, in which it states 10 shillings was paid to several men for the burying of 50 dead corpses within Mr. Abney's ward and the Newark when the town was taken by the King's men. Sadly, the site has not been formally excavated, and so we cannot be certain of the date of these burials until it is. However, it is clear that the burials seem to be the result of a single mass event, and so the time frame and the location would strongly suggest that here is where at least some of those 709 victims of the Siege of Leicester are buried. Now let's go north. Following some victory celebrations with his commanding officers, and after writing to his wife expressing his hopeful elation, all from the comfort of his lodgings here at Cavendish House in Abbey Park, King Charles's attention quickly returns to the war. Aware of the need to repair the physical damage dealt to the town by his own troops, Charles made Hastings Lord Loughborough the Governor of Leicester, and, along with Matthew Appleyard as his colonel, commanded them to refortify the town and defend it from parliamentarian counter-attack. Immediately the breaches were repaired in the defensive walls, especially in the Newark. However, due to the length of the walls around the town, it was decided to concentrate any new fortifications at the south defences, where a parliamentary attack was deemed most likely. So by the 3rd of June, the suburb to the south of the town, including some 120 houses, was already being pulled down. I expect, despite any objections from the people who actually lived there. In addition to repairing the breach in the Newark's southern wall along Bonner's Lane, the Royalists also extended the trench defending that wall towards the river. Interestingly, after the siege, one of the town's defenders, Major Innes, stated that, in place in the Newark where the breach was made, the town committee would never suffer to be fortified because Master Wadland, clerk of the committee, and a powerful man with them, had a parcel of ground lying there, which he was unwilling should be cut up. If this statement is true, and so far as the archaeology, that does seem to suggest there was no ditch in the area prior to the siege, then this may explain why the Royalists attacked this area and attacked it so heavily. It has even been suggested by one person at the time that had the Newark been more heavily fortified prior to the siege, the Royalists may not have attacked the town at all. Sadly, such what-ifs will have to be reserved for future debates. Once plans to re-secure the town were made, and buoyed by his victory at Leicester, the King's confidence was at a high and he decided to take the fight to Fairfax. So, on the 4th of June, the Royalist forces marched south on a mission to relieve the parliamentary siege at Oxford. Clearly though, Charles was confident that Leicester would come under attack from parliamentarian forces at some point, as not only did he leave a garrison of 1,200 soldiers to defend the town, he also had Cavendish House behind me torched and burned to the ground, to prevent it falling into his enemy's hands. After the Civil War, the Cavendish lands were confiscated by the parliamentarians, and so the house was never rebuilt, and as you can see, the ruins behind me remain to this day. But what of the parliamentarians? How did they respond to the savage attack on Leicester? Follow me. News spread of the defeat and sack of Leicester like wildfire. And just 2 days later, on the 3rd of June, the Earl of Northumberland reported to Parliament that Leicester had fallen, that many hundreds of ours were put to the sword, and that there were spared neither man nor woman. Continuing, it is said that the honest women, to preserve themselves from violence, did throw scalding water upon the soldiers of the king, which was one cause they dealt so unmercifully with them. Soon the horrors of June the 1st in Leicester were being compared with the sack of Magdeburg during the 30 Years' War, and even the sacking of Rome in 1525. Almost immediately, the people of London presented a petition to the House of Commons referring to the inexpressible loss of Leicester, urging Fairfax and his army to avenge the barbarous cruelties practised there. Subsequently, the Earl of Northumberland advised the Lord General to abandon his siege of Oxford, meet the King's army in battle and regain Leicester before its defences could be repaired. With the support of the Commons, on the 5th of June, Fairfax abandoned the siege of Oxford and marched toward the Midlands. Unaware of Parliament's plans, Charles continued to travel south to recapture his capital. However, the siege and subsequent battle at Leicester had significantly depleted his forces, which had been reduced through the deaths and injuries sustained in the battle and the need to leave a garrison of 1,200 men to secure the town. So the king decided to stop off at Market Harborough to recruit more troops and await any stragglers. Whilst in the town, he learned that the siege of Oxford had been lifted and that Fairfax was on his way to meet him in battle. This doesn't seem to have bothered the king especially, who was perhaps still feeling confident after capturing Leicester. And so he continued to head southwest, travelling first here to Lubbenham and then across to Daventry in Northamptonshire. But at Daventry, the king holds the army for 6 days, perhaps gathering intelligence on the parliamentarian forces headed his way. By now, Fairfax's new model army is 14,000 strong, which is some 5,000 more soldiers than the king's. Also, Fairfax is now only 25 miles away. Realising he is outnumbered, Charles and the Royalist army backtrack, hoping to reach Belvoir Castle, where the king plans to draw in more soldiers from the surrounding Royalist towns. On Friday the 13th of June, Charles and the main body of the army stop for the night back here at Lubbenham, whilst Prince Rupert and his army continue on back into Market Harborough. But at 11 p.m, the king is woken to be told that Fairfax has taken the village of Nasby, just over the county border in Northamptonshire. The parliamentarians are too close for comfort, and so Charles mounts his horse and rushes to Market Harborough to find Rupert and his senior advisors. Upon arriving in the usually quiet market town, the king rouses his troops, gathers his aides and convenes a council of war. We don't know what discussions were had in that meeting, but what we do know is that despite being outnumbered, the king convinced his officers to turn and face Fairfax and the new model army. Perhaps he was dreaming of a second consecutive glorious victory from which he could triumphantly re-enter Oxford, or perhaps he now knew that he couldn't outrun Fairfax to Belvoir, and so it would be better to fight on ground of their choosing rather than being chased down. We simply don't know. Regardless, the plan was agreed, and on the morning of Saturday the 14th of June, Prince Rupert led his men out of the town and south across the county border. So let's go. Rupert stopped here on the first ridge south of Harborough, deciding it should be the Royalist defensive position. It was from here that he first saw Fairfax's forces on the far Nasby ridge. Neither Prince Rupert or the King had faced the recently formed New Model Army, which was here commanded by Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, and so perhaps they were not prepared for the efficiency of an army that consisted of professional soldiers and trained generals and commanders, rather than members of the aristocracy. But over the coming hours, across these fields below me, they would be taught a brutal lesson in a new type of warfare, a lesson that would leave hundreds of Royalists dead and the King's army broken and scattered. I will not go into the details of the Battle of Nasby here because, well, this is Hidden Histories of Leicester, not Northampton. But suffice to say that on the battlefield of Nasby, Fairfax and Cromwell smashed the Royalist army, killing 700 of their soldiers, capturing 5,000 more, as well as 9,000 weapons and all the King's artillery. This was the first decisive victory of the war, and it signalled the death knell for the Royalist army, which never fully recovered and struggled on until the summer of 1646, which was when the First Civil War ended. But as with the battle at Leicester, the end of the fighting did not mean the end of the bloodshed. And as the King and the remnants of his army fled back north towards Leicester, the parliamentarians were about to demonstrate that cruelty towards the defenceless was a justifiable part of the English Civil War for both sides. Throughout history, a significant part of every marching army has been the camp followers. These are the people who, although not directly part of the army, would follow it wherever it went. They could be merchants selling their wares to the soldiers, blacksmiths and skilled workmen repairing armour and equipment, seamstresses and prostitutes. A large number of these followers would also have been the soldiers' wives, and possibly their young children. When the Royalist army at Nasby broke and was routed, then a natural instinct for many of the soldiers was to turn back the way they'd come and just run. Inevitably, this led many back to the army camp where their followers had been waiting for news of the battle. With parliamentarian soldiers hot on their heels, I imagine all hell broke loose as men, women and children literally ran for their lives. Many of the Royalist camp followers were captured by the parliamentary troops, and one report states that 100 of these captives were murdered in cold blood, whilst many more were marked as whores by having their noses slit to the bone and their faces cut and mutilated. Those who weren't immediately captured were being chased across the South Leicestershire countryside between Market Harborough and Leicester. About 400 retreating soldiers were cut down by parliamentarian troops as they desperately scrambled over hedges, ran down lanes and across fields in an attempt to head north to their homes and to their families. Whether this cruelty was in revenge for what had happened at Leicester we can never know, but certainly it showed that neither side could really claim the moral high ground in this conflict. Having evaded capture at Nasby, Charles and Rupert flee north on horseback, stopping briefly here at Wistow Hall. In what can only be an attempt to be less recognisable and less conspicuous, the pair swap their ornate saddles and bridles for plain ones, and then, on fresh horses, head off for the safety of Ashby Castle, where they stayed the night before heading west. After the battle, Fairfax gathers his troops and begins the march towards Leicester in the hope of retaking the town as the Commons had ordered. On the 15th of June, the day after Nasby, he and his army spend the night camped here at Great Glen before heading off to Leicester the next day. On Monday the 16th of July, Fairfax and his army surrounded Leicester before sending a surrender demand into the town. However, in the interim, Hastings and the 1,200 Royalist soldiers, along with around 400 local men aged 16 to 60 that had been pressed into service for the King, had been busy filling many of the breaches in the defences and building new ones. They were armed and ready, so not willing to back down to Fairfax just yet. Thus, the second siege of Leicester began. By the morning of Tuesday the 17th of July, Fairfax had grown tired of waiting. so he had a battery of cannon raised at the same spot the Royalists had used just south of the Newark, probably using the same guns used during the first siege captured by Parliament at Nasby. The cannons soon began to bombard the Newark, smashing through the repaired breach in the south wall by midday. Faced with whether to surrender or resist Fairfax's clearly superior force, Hastings immediately surrenders. However, to prevent his own capture and limit the losses to his army, he sends his trumpeter to the parliamentary camp to propose the surrender conditions. Fairfax agrees and sends two of his colonels, Pickering and Rainsborough, to negotiate the terms of surrender with Hastings, probably here in the Guildhall. However, as the day drags on and, uncertain of where King Charles and the remains of his army actually are, Fairfax begins to wonder if Hastings is just playing for time. And so he continues with his siege preparations, making grenades and raising scaling ladders. Finally, at 2 AM on the morning of Wednesday the 18th of July, the terms of surrender are formally agreed. At 10 AM that morning, the Royalists march out of Leicester, having been guaranteed safe passage to Ashby and Lichfield, along with the officers who were allowed to take their horses and private arms with them. The Royalists left behind 14 cannons, 2,000 weapons, 50 barrels of gunpowder, a whole lot of ammunition and 500 horses, all of which was soon incorporated into the parliamentary supplies. The town of Leicester was once again under parliamentary control, thankfully this time without a drop of blood being spilled. This news was met with such jubilation in Westminster that a day of Thanksgiving was voted for. Although you may not be aware of it, from that time to this, June the 19th is officially the Relief of Leicester Day. How cool is that? For the Royalists, the defeat at Nasby really was the beginning of the end. Although Charles and the remnants of his army regrouped and continued to fight, Nasby had mortally wounded his power base. The war continued despite his unwitting capture in 1646, escape and recapture in November 1647. The Second Civil War ended with the Royalist defeat at the Battle of Preston in August 1648, and Charles was subsequently tried for high treason and other high crimes on the 20th of January 1649. During the trial, the sacking of Leicester was specifically highlighted as an example of the King's cruelty. Throughout the trial, Charles refused to plead or justify his actions, claiming the courts had no jurisdiction over a monarch and that only God could judge him. He was declared guilty of his crimes on the 27th of January, sentenced to death and publicly executed on Tuesday the 30th of January 1649. Interestingly, of the 59 commissioners who signed Charles's death warrant and who would become infamously known as the Regicides, 6 had connections to Leicester or the county. These were Thomas Waite, who was either from Wymondham in Leicestershire or Market Overton in Rutland. He was a parliamentary soldier who later became governor of Burley on the Hill in Rutland. Thomas Horton was another parliamentary soldier, this time from Gumley in South Leicestershire. He had been badly wounded at Nasby, but returned to the army later. Henry Smith was the MP for Leicestershire, and Peter Temple, who had been made MP for Leicester in 1645 after the siege. Colonel Francis Hacker, who had valiantly defended Leicester during the siege and continued to distinguish himself in battle throughout the war. Although he didn't sign the death warrant, Hacker was considered a regicide because he was the officer of the guard at the execution of the king. And finally, our old friend Lord Thomas Grey of Groby, who was actually the second person to sign his name to the execution document. Of the county's 6 regicides, both Grey and Horton died prior to the restoration of the monarchy. Upon Charles II's return, Smith, Waite and Temple were all imprisoned for the rest of their lives. However, Colonel Hacker was executed for his part in the regicide by being hanged at Tyburn on the 19th of October 1660. The third and final English Civil War was focused around Charles I's son, also called Charles. After the execution of the king, the Scottish Parliament declared the younger Charles, who was in exile in the Netherlands, King of Britain. However, they would only support Charles in claiming his crown if he made a number of concessions to the Scottish authority. Reluctantly, Charles eventually accepted the terms and returned to Britain on the 23rd of June 1650. What followed was a bitter campaign lasting 15 months, which saw parliamentarian forces invade Scotland and Scottish forces invade England. But on the 3rd of September 1651, Oliver Cromwell smashed the Royalist army at the Battle of Worcester, and Charles fled under cover for his life to France. This was the final battle of the English Civil War. For the people of Leicester, after the second siege of the town in July 1645, the rest of the Civil War mostly passed them by, which was a good thing considering the devastation that had been wrought upon them. It's hard to fully imagine how the people of Leicester moved on from the wanton destruction and murder that would have touched the lives of all in the town. However, we can get a sense of the impact of those few weeks in the early summer of 1645 from the petitions that local people made to the authorities following the siege. These include the petition of Catherine Palmer, whose husband was a weaver. He had been taken captive during the battle and held prisoner until its recapture by Fairfax. During his captivity, not only were his workshop and possessions plundered, he also became gravely ill and later died. However, the Weavers' Guild still sought payment from Catherine for business loans her husband took prior to the siege, and she seeks the town's help to pay them or to release her from the obligation. There's also the tailor William Summer, who, in addition to having his son killed in the battle and his wife in some state of physical and mental distraction ever since the sacking, also had his house pulled down, fruit trees cut down and all property destroyed. So he can no longer work as a tailor, according to the guild rules. He therefore begs the authorities to allow him to become a botcher, a person who merely patches and repairs clothes rather than makes new items, just so that he can earn a living for his family. And there's this, the petition of Francis Stevens and Constance Brewing, which reads: To the right worshipful His Majesty's Justice of the Peace, at the Castle of Leicester for this county. In all humble manner shows unto your worship, whereas your petitioners' late husbands were both of them soldiers in the service of the Parliament, and served in this garrison of Leicester. The husbands of the said Francis Stevens lost his life at the taking of Leicester by the King's forces, and the husband of the said widow Brewing, being also a trooper, whom also lost his life in the service of the Parliament. And your petitioners, by reason of loss of their husbands, are fallen into great want and poverty, being left with many small children. The said widow Stevens with 6, and the said widow Brewing with 2. And now your poor petitioners most humbly beg your worships to take them and their poor children into your most charitable consideration, in granting unto them such weekly allowances as is mentioned to be allowed, and is your charitable consideration shall seem most fitting. And they and their poor children shall ever pray for all your health and happiness. The English Civil War is one of the darkest chapters in England's history. Over the course of 9 years, families, communities and whole towns across the entire country were ripped apart at the seams. It is thought that around 180,000 people died as a result of the civil wars, which was about 3.6% of the overall population of the country. But many of these deaths were not those of soldiers on the battlefield, but of the weak and defenceless who happened to stand in the way of both armies. It has been said that wars do not make one great, and this is certainly the case with the English Civil War, where atrocities were blatantly committed by both the Royalist and Parliamentarian sides. This was not a civil war, if there can ever be such a thing. It was an uncivil war. In 1660, just 9 years after his defeat at the Battle of Worcester, the exiled Prince of Wales was welcomed back with open arms and crowned King Charles II, leaving many wondering what all the bloodshed had actually been for. Of course, the nation, including the people of Leicester and Leicestershire, would have to readjust to the new monarchy, and Despite earlier promises, King Charles would go on to seek revenge against the regicides who killed his father. But that, as they say, is a whole other story. As ever, I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the English Civil War. If so, please like, share and comment. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.